A man born into servitude changed medicine forever, then died alone in a tavern with nothing but enemies and revolutionaries to mourn him. His name was Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, though history remembers him by the name he chose for himself, Paracelsus. The name meant beyond Celsus, beyond the greatest Roman medical authority. It was the kind of arrogance that made people want to punch him in the face, and plenty tried. But here's what's strange. This same man, despised by virtually every medical authority of his time, laid the groundwork for toxicology, pioneered chemical medicine, recognized mental illness as actual disease rather than demonic possession, and fundamentally changed how we understand the human body. The universities that expelled him now teach his ideas. The physicians who called him a fraud now follow principles he established. So who was this person? And how did someone so universally hated become so foundational? The story begins in 1493 in Einsiedeln, Switzerland, in a house next to a bridge over the Seal River. But to understand Paracelsus, you need to understand what that birth meant. His father, Wilhelm Bombast von Hohenheim, was the illegitimate son of German nobles. His mother, Elsa Oschner, was a bondswoman at the local Benedictine Abbey. A bondswoman. Her labour belonged to the church, and because of that, her son's status was permanently compromised. Paracelsus was born what they called a semi-serf. Even at his death decades later, church authorities could claim his belongings because they'd once owned his mother's labour. Think about that. Your mother's legal status determining what happens to your property after you die. Medieval Europe wasn't subtle about class. This mixed-class birth created something dangerous. A man who understood both worlds, but belonged to neither. The nobility saw him as tainted by common blood. The common people saw him as the son of a physician with noble connections. He existed in a permanent state of social displacement, and that displacement would define everything he became. Because when you don't fit into the existing hierarchy, you have two choices: accept your marginalization or burn the hierarchy down. Paracelsus chose fire. His childhood was marked by loss early. His mother died when he was 9. We don't know how, the records don't say. But in 1502, his father packed up their belongings and moved to Villach in southern Austria, where Wilhelm had secured a position as town physician. The boy who had become Paracelsus spent his formative years in a mining town, watching his father treat the sick and injured, learning about herbs and minerals, observing the brutal reality of medical practice in the early 16th century. Which is to say, watching people die despite the treatments. Wilhelm educated his son directly. Botany, medicine, mineralogy, mining, natural philosophy. But the education went beyond books. Villach sat in the heart of mining country, and mining meant chemistry. Not the chemistry of textbooks, but the practical chemistry of smelting and refining. The young Theophrastus, as he was called then, watched metals transform in furnaces. He saw copper turn to brass, watched silver separate from lead, observed the way different substances reacted when combined. This wasn't abstract theory. This was transformation happening in front of him. Substances changing their fundamental nature through processes that seemed almost magical. The Fugger family, wealthy merchant bankers from Augsburg, had established a mining school in the region, the Bergschule. Wilhelm taught there chemical theory and practice for young men being trained to oversee mining operations. His son absorbed everything: gold, tin, mercury, iron, alum, copper sulfate. The earth contained all these things, and through the right processes, you could extract them, purify them, change them. Alchemists believed you could transmute lead into gold. Standing in a smelting house watching one metal become another, that belief didn't seem so absurd. One book changed everything. Works by Isaac Holland, a semi-legendary alchemist, fell into the boy's hands. We don't know exactly which text or how he obtained it, but from that moment, according to later accounts, he became obsessed. If metals could be transformed, refined, perfected, Why not the human body? Why couldn't disease be treated with the same precision that turned raw ores into pure silver? The medicines of the time were almost entirely herbal. Physicians consulted ancient texts describing plant remedies that hadn't changed in 1,000 years. What if they were wrong? What if the answer wasn't in plants but in minerals, in chemicals, in the transformative processes he'd watched in the mines? This is where most biographies mentioned his formal education, and that's where things get complicated. The traditional story says he received tutoring from 4 bishops and Johannes Trithemius, the famous abbot of Sponheim. But there's a problem. No records place Trithemius anywhere near Einsiedeln for extended periods, and there's no evidence young Theophrastus visited Sponheim or Würzburg before Trithemius died in 1516. He probably read their works, he almost certainly studied their ideas, but the romanticised image of personal tutoring from great scholars is likely fiction. What we know for certain is that at 16 he entered the University of Basel. Alchemy, surgery, medicine. The curriculum was traditional, rooted in ancient authorities. Galen, Avicenna, the Greek and Arabic physicians whose texts formed the foundation of medical education. Students memorized their theories about the 4 humours, about hot and cold, wet and dry. They learned to diagnose by examining urine and taking pulses. They prepared medicines according to recipes that hadn't changed since antiquity. And Theophrastus, watching all this, seems to have thought, this is completely wrong. Around 1515 he received a doctorate from the University of Ferrara in Italy, medicine and surgery. He was now officially qualified to practice, but something happened during or immediately after his university years that reveals everything about his personality. In 1516 he began calling himself Paracelsus. Paracelsus, beyond Celsus. Aulus Cornelius Celsus had been a 1st century Roman medical writer, respected but not especially prominent in the medical canon. By choosing this name, Paracelsus was making a declaration. He wasn't just following the authorities, he was surpassing them. He was better than the entire tradition. The audacity is breathtaking. A 23-year-old doctor, fresh from university, announces to the world that he's greater than the classical masters. It's the kind of move that makes people hate you instantly, which might be why he was also forced to leave Basel hurriedly that same year. The official reason given was trouble over his studies of necromancy, communicating with the dead. Whether this was actual occult practice or simply a charge used to expel an arrogant troublemaker, we can't know. But Paracelsus was gone, degree in hand, new name declared, and no particular place to go. So he travelled. For the next decade, Paracelsus wandered across Europe and possibly beyond, accumulating the experiences that would shape his revolutionary approach to medicine. The exact itinerary is debated, but the broad outline is clear. He went everywhere. Denmark, Venice, Austria, France, possibly Arabia, Egypt, Constantinople, even India, and Tibet according to some accounts. Though these distant journeys are harder to verify. What's certain is that he wasn't travelling as a scholar or a gentleman. He was working, army surgeon, town physician, whatever paid and allowed him to practice and observe. Military service taught him things no university could. Battlefield medicine strips away theory. A soldier with a sword wound doesn't care about your knowledge of Galen. He needs treatment that works immediately. Paracelsus learned to treat wounds by watching what actually healed them versus what the textbooks prescribed. He observed infections, gangrene, the body's responses to trauma, and he started developing his own methods, often contradicting established practice. Traditional physicians believed wounds needed to be kept clean and packed with various substances. Paracelsus noticed that wounds that were allowed to drain naturally often healed better. This was heresy, but it worked. He served as an army physician in Denmark from 1518 to 1521. 3 years watching Danish soldiers suffer and die, learning what treatments helped and which were useless. In 1522, he joined military forces in Venice, Different armies, different conditions, but the same fundamental questions. How do you keep people alive? What actually cures disease? The universities taught one set of answers. Experience taught another. And increasingly, Paracelsus trusted experience over books. But military service was only part of his education. He worked in the mines of Austria, studying chemistry and toxicology firsthand. Miners' diseases fascinated him. Men who spent years underground developed characteristic illnesses. Their lungs failed. They coughed blood. Traditional physicians blamed demons or divine punishment. Paracelsus observed the fumes from melted metals, the dust in the air, the chemical processes happening in mining operations. What if the diseases weren't supernatural? What if they were caused by the substances the miners inhaled? This insight that environmental factors could cause disease was revolutionary, and it came from watching miners die. He travelled from Spain to the Netherlands, from Germany to Alexandria. Everywhere he went, he talked to people the universities ignored. Folk healers, barber surgeons, midwives, herbalists, alchemists, anyone who actually treated the sick, rather than just lecturing about theory. The universities do not teach all things, he would later write. A doctor must seek out old wives, gypsies, sorcerers, wandering tribes, old robbers, and such outlaws, and take lessons from them. This wasn't romanticism. This was pragmatism. These people had knowledge that worked, even if they couldn't explain why in Latin. His maxim became, a doctor must be a traveller. Knowledge is experience. Not knowledge from books, not knowledge from authority. Knowledge from doing, from watching, from trying things and seeing what happened. This empirical approach, this insistence on observation over tradition, would become the foundation of his medical philosophy. But it also made him enemies. Because if experience matters more than books, then what's the point of all those expensive university degrees? By 1524, he was trying to settle down. He returned to Villach, his childhood home, and found that rumours of his miraculous cures had preceded him. Whether these cures were genuinely miraculous or just competent treatment that looked impressive compared to the usual medical practice, people wanted his services. He established himself in nearby Salzburg, working as a doctor, finally putting down roots. And this is when his writing career began. The first dated works by Paracelsus come from the Salzburg period. Theological writings on the Virgin Mary, the Holy Trinity, critiques of church practices, but also medical texts. Since 1519 or 1520, he'd been working on medical manuscripts, and now he completed two major works: Elf Tractat, describing 11 common diseases and their treatment, and Volumen Medicinae Paramerum, laying out his early medical principles. These weren't published immediately. Publishing was expensive and required approval from authorities who had no reason to approve this upstart's radical ideas. But he was writing, developing his theories, preparing the intellectual ammunition for the battles ahead. The content of these early works reveals his thinking. Disease wasn't an imbalance of the four humours, the traditional explanation. Disease came from outside the body. Specific diseases had specific causes and required specific treatments. This sounds obvious now. It was heretical then. The entire medical establishment was built on humoral theory. If Paracelsus was right, everything they taught was wrong. He was also contemplating bigger questions: the meaning of life and death, the nature of health, the causes of disease, whether internal imbalances or external forces, the place of humans in the universe, the relationship between humans and God. These weren't separate from his medical work. For Paracelsus, medicine, philosophy, theology, and alchemy were all part of the same quest to understand creation and our place in it. But his time in Salzburg ended abruptly. The Peasants' War had been building across German-speaking lands, a massive uprising of common people against the nobility and church authorities who oppressed them. When the revolt reached Salzburg in 1525, Paracelsus made a choice that would define his political identity. He sided with the rebels. Not quietly, not carefully, openly. A physician with noble blood in his veins stood with the peasants, demanding their freedom. And when the revolt was crushed, as these things always were, Paracelsus had to flee immediately. He left behind most of his belongings, including likely many of his manuscripts. Why did he do it? A man trying to establish himself professionally, to finally find stability after years of wandering, throws it all away to support a doomed rebellion. The answer lies in his birth. Semi-serf, neither noble nor common. He'd spent his entire life being told he didn't quite belong, that his mother's status made him lesser. The peasants were fighting against exactly the system that had marked him from birth. Of course he sided with them, even if it meant losing everything he'd built. So at 32, Paracelsus was on the run again. No home, few possessions, a fugitive from authorities who didn't look kindly on rebel sympathizers. But he had something more valuable than property. He had a decade of experience treating diseases across Europe. He had theories that contradicted everything the medical establishment taught. He had the arrogance to believe he was right and they were wrong. And he had absolutely nothing left to lose, which is the perfect time to burn everything down. Because in 1527, just 2 years after fleeing Salzburg as a political refugee, Paracelsus would walk into Basel and commit an act so outrageous, so deliberately offensive, that people are still talking about it 500 years later. But before we get to what he did in Basel, you need to understand what Basel meant. The city wasn't just another stop on his wandering journey. It was the intellectual heart of the German-speaking world, home to one of Europe's great universities, the place where Erasmus himself lived and worked. And Paracelsus was about to declare war on everything it represented. Basel in 1527 was a city that thought it knew everything. The printing presses never stopped. Erasmus lived there, editing Greek texts and corresponding with the greatest minds in Europe. The university attracted scholars from across the continent. The medical faculty taught according to Galen and Avicenna, the same text used for 1,000 years, refined and perfected through generations of commentary. And then Paracelsus showed up. He arrived with a reputation, but not the kind the faculty wanted. Stories preceded him. Miraculous cures, unorthodox methods, a refusal to show proper deference to established authorities. But he also had something they needed. Erasmus himself had recommended him, and Erasmus's word carried weight. The publisher, Johann Froben, Erasmus's close friend, had been suffering from a leg infection. The local physicians wanted to amputate. Paracelsus said no, treated it with his own remedies, and Froben kept his leg. That success earned Paracelsus an appointment as city physician and lecturer at the university. The position should have been his path to respectability, stability, the legitimacy he'd never quite achieved. Instead, it became the stage for one of the most spectacular acts of academic vandalism in history. On June 5, 1527, Paracelsus posted his lecture announcements on the university notice board. The format was standard. The content was not. He invited everyone to attend. Not just enrolled students, everyone. Townspeople, barbers, apothecaries, anyone interested in medicine. The faculty was already uneasy. Universities didn't work like that. Knowledge was controlled, dispensed according to hierarchy and privilege. Then came his first lecture. He spoke in German, not Latin. This wasn't just unconventional, it was an insult. Latin was the language of learning, the mark of an educated man. Speaking German meant addressing common people as equals. It meant rejecting the entire structure that separated scholars from craftsmen, theory from practice, those who knew from those who merely did. His content matched his language. He didn't lecture from Galen or Avicenna. He lectured from experience, from what he'd seen in army camps and mining towns, from treatments that actually worked, not theories that sounded elegant in Latin. He talked about using minerals in medicine, about specific diseases having specific causes, about observation mattering more than ancient authority. The faculty was appalled, students were fascinated, people came from across Basel to hear this strange physician who spoke their language and promised to teach them medicine that actually healed people. But Paracelsus wasn't satisfied with merely contradicting tradition. He wanted to destroy it. And on June 23rd, 1527, during the celebration of St. John's Day, he did exactly that. Picture the scene: a bonfire in the market square, students celebrating, and Paracelsus standing before them with a copy of Avicenna's Canon of Medicine. This wasn't just any book, it was the foundation of medical education. 1,000 years of accumulated knowledge, commentaries upon commentaries. Every medical student spent years studying it. It represented everything the university stood for. Paracelsus threw it into the fire. He mixed sulfur and nitre with it to make it burn hotter, faster. He stood there watching the pages blacken and curl, and he explained to the horrified crowd exactly why he was doing this. Because Avicenna was wrong. Galen was wrong. The entire edifice of traditional medicine was built on sand, and he was going to prove it. The symbolism was deliberate and devastating. Book burning meant something in 1527. Martin Luther had burned the papal bull threatening him with excommunication just 7 years earlier. Everyone understood what fire meant: rejection, defiance, revolution. The comparison to Luther wasn't accidental. People started calling Paracelsus the Luther of medicine. Both men challenged ancient authorities. Both insisted on using the vernacular instead of Latin. Both claimed that the established institutions were corrupt and needed to be torn down and rebuilt. Paracelsus hated the comparison. Years later he'd write, "I leave it to Luther to defend what he says, and I will be responsible for what I say. That which you wish to Luther, you wish also to me. You wish us both in the fire." But the label stuck because it captured something true. Paracelsus wasn't just proposing reforms, he was declaring war. His lectures became more provocative. He brought in barber surgeons to demonstrate techniques. He invited apothecaries to explain their craft. He treated them as equals, as people whose practical knowledge mattered more than academic credentials. The faculty physicians were supposed to be superior to these tradesmen. Paracelsus said, "No, you're not. They know more than you do because they actually work with patients." Then came the incident with the excrement. The stories vary in details, but the core is consistent. Paracelsus invited the faculty to a special lecture where he promised to reveal the greatest secret in medicine. They came curious despite their anger. He uncovered a dish containing human feces. The physicians fled disgusted. Paracelsus shouted after them, "If you will not hear the mysteries of putrefactive fermentation, you are unworthy of the name of physicians." Was he making a serious point about digestion and disease? Probably. Was he also deliberately humiliating them? Absolutely. Paracelsus understood theatre. He knew how to make people pay attention, and he knew that offending the powerful was sometimes the only way to break through their certainty. His actual medical practice was succeeding. That made everything worse for his enemies. If he'd been wrong, they could have dismissed him. But he was curing people the traditional physicians had given up on. Wounds that wouldn't heal, fevers that wouldn't break, conditions the medical texts had no answers for. He treated them with his mineral remedies, his chemical preparations, and people recovered. Each success validated his methods. Each validation infuriated the establishment. They'd spent years mastering Galen and Avicenna. They'd earned their positions through proper channels. And here was this wanderer, this peasant's son, this drunk who lectured in German and burned sacred texts, making them look like fools by actually healing the sick. The conflict couldn't last. Paracelsus's appointment as city physician came with a salary that was supposed to be paid by the city council. A wealthy cleric named Cornelius von Lichtenfels had been treated by Paracelsus for some illness. The treatment worked. Paracelsus expected payment. Lichtenfels paid much less than promised. Paracelsus sued. The case went to court. The judges, sympathetic to the church establishment, ruled against Paracelsus. He responded by publicly denouncing them as corrupt and incompetent. In 1528, less than a year after burning Avicenna, Paracelsus was forced to leave Basel in the middle of the night. The city council had had enough. The faculty had had enough. The church had had enough. His enemies were circling, and staying meant arrest or worse. So he fled again, leaving behind his belongings, his position, any hope of stability. The Basel episode lasted barely 18 months, but it defined Paracelsus for history. That's when he became the revolutionary, the heretic, the man who burned the books and spoke truth to power. Every biographical sketch mentions it. Every discussion of his influence returns to that bonfire in the market square. What did he actually accomplish there? Professionally, nothing. He lost his position, made powerful enemies, burned bridges he'd never rebuild. His medical theories weren't adopted by the university. His students scattered. Within months, it was as if he'd never been there. But the gesture mattered. The symbolic act of destruction mattered. Because Paracelsus understood something his contemporaries didn't. You can't reform a system that believes it's already perfect. You can't convince people to reconsider when they're certain they already know everything. Sometimes you have to burn it down and start over. The medical establishment in 1527 wasn't going to accept that diseases had specific causes requiring specific treatments. They weren't going to abandon humoral theory because one outsider said it was wrong. They weren't going to learn from barbers and apothecaries. They had their texts, their traditions, their certainty. So Paracelsus showed them what he thought of their certainty. He burned their sacred book in public and dared them to prove him wrong. They couldn't. They could only silence him, which they did. But ideas don't burn. The students who heard those German lectures remembered them. The patients who were cured by his mineral remedies remembered them. The physicians who saw him treat wounds without cauterization, who watched him use laudanum for pain, who heard him explain disease as invasion rather than imbalance, they remembered too, even if they wouldn't admit it publicly. The Basel affair also revealed something about Paracelsus himself. He could have been diplomatic, could have introduced his ideas gradually, won allies, built support. He chose confrontation instead, deliberately, repeatedly, almost compulsively, as if he needed to provoke rejection, needed to prove that the establishment would never accept him, regardless of how right he was. Was that because of his birth? The semi-serf who could never quite belong? The physician's son who wasn't quite noble? Maybe. Or maybe he'd just seen too much of the world to respect authorities who'd never left their libraries. He'd treated wounds on battlefields while they debated Galen's theories. He'd watched miners die from lung diseases while they blamed bad humours. He'd learned from folk healers and executioners and prostitutes while they insisted knowledge could only come from Greek texts. From his perspective, they were killing people through ignorance and arrogance. Every patient who died because a physician followed Avicenna instead of observing symptoms was a victim of their pride. Every amputation ordered because they didn't understand wound healing was a mutilation caused by their adherence to tradition over evidence. So yes, he burned their book. He insulted them publicly. He invited common people to his lectures and treated tradesmen as intellectual equals. Because from where he stood, the medical establishment wasn't worthy of respect. They were obstacles to progress, gatekeepers protecting their status at the cost of human lives. This wasn't a man who could compromise. This wasn't someone who would moderate his message to win approval. Paracelsus had chosen his path in Salzburg when he sided with the peasants. He doubled down in Basel when he burned Avicenna. He was going to challenge every authority, defy every convention, offend every powerful person who crossed his path. And he was going to keep moving, because staying anywhere too long meant the authorities would catch up, meant they'd arrest him, or silence him, or force him to conform. Better to stay ahead of them. Keep wondering, keep treating patients, keep writing, keep fighting. The pattern was set. For the next 15 years, Paracelsus would travel across German-speaking Europe, never settling anywhere for long. He'd treat patients, gather students, write furiously, make enemies, and move on before they could destroy him. He'd produce some of his most important work during these wandering years, but he'd never again have a position like Basel. Never again have the platform to directly challenge the medical establishment from within their own institutions. They'd expelled him, driven him out, made him a fugitive from their world, and in doing so, they'd freed him to become something more dangerous than a university lecturer. They'd created a voice that couldn't be controlled or silenced, a physician who owed them nothing and feared them even less. The wanderer was back on the road, and the war was just beginning. Between 1528 and 1541, Paracelsus existed in constant motion. He'd established the pattern in Basel: show up somewhere, treat patients successfully, gather students, write prolifically, offend the local authorities, and leave before they could arrest him. Rinse and repeat across German-speaking Europe. He was remarkably productive during these years. Most of his major medical works were written while he had no fixed address, no institutional support, no steady income. Just him, his travelling chest of medicines and manuscripts, and whatever city would tolerate him for a few months. Nuremberg in 1529 should have been different. The city was a centre of Renaissance learning, home to humanist scholars and progressive thinkers. They'd initially welcomed him, interested in his revolutionary ideas about treating diseases with chemicals rather than herbs. He cured several cases of elephantiasis there. The disease caused grotesque swelling of limbs and skin, considered essentially untreatable by conventional medicine. Paracelsus approached it as a specific entity caused by external agents, not an imbalance of humours. His mineral-based treatments worked. Testimonials documenting these cures still exist in Nuremberg's archives, but success didn't protect him. The medical faculty denounced him as an imposter. His writings on syphilis particularly enraged them because he'd attacked their preferred treatment. Conventional physicians were prescribing guaiac wood, an expensive import from the New World. Paracelsus called it worthless, a scam perpetrated by the Fugger banking family who controlled the wood's importation. He was right. Guaiac wood did nothing for syphilis, but being right didn't matter when you were accusing one of Europe's wealthiest families of profiting from fake medicine. The Fuggers had connections everywhere. In 1530, Nuremberg authorities banned the printing of Paracelsus's books. This was devastating. He'd hoped to reach wider audiences through published works, since he couldn't maintain a permanent teaching position. Now, even that avenue was being closed. His ideas would remain locked in manuscripts, accessible only to those who could obtain hand-copied versions. So he moved on. Beretshausen in 1530, then St. Gallen, then Appenzell, then Zurich. Each stay lasted months at best. He'd rent rooms, see patients, write furiously, and inevitably wear out his welcome. The writing continued regardless. The Paragranum, completed around 1530, laid out his 4 pillars of medicine: natural philosophy, astronomy, alchemy, and virtue. This wasn't just medical theory, it was a complete reimagining of what a physician needed to know and how that knowledge should be acquired. Natural philosophy meant understanding nature through observation, not ancient texts. Astronomy meant recognizing cosmic influences on human health. Though Paracelsus's astronomy was more about harmonies between macrocosm and microcosm than modern astronomy. Alchemy provided the practical tools for preparing medicines and understanding matter's transformations, and virtue meant the physician's moral character and divine calling. You needed all four. A physician with only book learning was worthless. One who understood chemistry but lacked moral integrity was dangerous. The whole person had to be developed, trained not just in techniques, but in understanding their place in nature's order. During these wandering years, Paracelsus also developed his prima theory more fully. Sulfur, mercury, and salt, the three principles that composed all matter. Not the physical substances bearing those names, but essential qualities. Sulfur represented the combustible, mercury the fluid, and changeable, salt the solid and permanent. Diseases, he argued, arose when these principles became unbalanced or corrupted in the body. Each disease had three potential cures depending on which principle was afflicted. A disease caused by corrupted sulfur required a sulfur-based remedy. Mercury diseases needed mercury treatments. Salt diseases needed salt. This sounds bizarre to modern ears, but it was actually more sophisticated than the humoral theory it challenged. Paracelsus was trying to create a systematic framework linking disease causes to specific treatments. He was seeking principles that explained why particular medicines worked for particular conditions. The emphasis on specificity was revolutionary. Traditional medicine treated fever as fever, regardless of cause. Paracelsus insisted that different diseases produced different fevers requiring different treatments. Observe the symptoms carefully, identify the specific disease entity, match the treatment to the cause. He was also writing about mental illness during these years. This alone distinguishes him from nearly every physician of his era. Mental disorders were generally attributed to demonic possession or divine punishment. Treatment involved exorcism, prayer, or simply chaining the afflicted person in a basement. Paracelsus called this barbaric. Mental illnesses were real diseases with natural causes. They originated in the body's chemistry, in imbalances that affected the brain's functioning. He didn't have the language or concepts to explain neurochemistry, but he understood that madness wasn't supernatural. It was medical. He advocated humane treatment. No chains, no exorcisms, no violence. These were sick people deserving care and therapy. The physician's job was to understand what had gone wrong in their body's chemistry and correct it through proper medicines. This was centuries ahead of its time. The word unconscious appears in Paracelsus's writings, perhaps the first time anyone used that concept. He recognized that human psychology had depths beyond conscious awareness, that healing required addressing more than just physical symptoms. But nobody listened. His writings circulated in manuscript, read by the handful of students who travelled with him or sought him out. The medical establishment ignored or ridiculed everything he published. The syphilis epidemic was raging. This disease had appeared in Europe around 1495, possibly imported from the Americas, though the origin was debated. By Paracelsus's time, it was pandemic, spreading rapidly through populations, causing horrific symptoms and killing thousands. Conventional treatment was mercury applied externally, often causing mercury poisoning that killed patients faster than the disease, or the useless Gaiac wood, or bleeding and purging according to humoral theory. Nothing worked. Paracelsus approached syphilis as a specific disease entity requiring specific treatment. He used mercury too, but administered it carefully in controlled doses, understanding that the difference between medicine and poison was dosage. All things are poison, and nothing is without poison, he wrote. Only the dose makes a thing not a poison. This principle, the foundation of modern toxicology, came from his practical experience. He'd seen mercury cure syphilis when used correctly and kill patients when used carelessly. The substance wasn't inherently good or bad, Application determined outcome. His syphilis treatises circulated despite the Nuremberg printing ban. Physicians might denounce him publicly, but privately they read his work and sometimes adopted his methods. They just didn't acknowledge the source. In 1536, something remarkable happened. His Chirurgia Magna was published in Augsburg, the Great Surgery, a comprehensive surgical text incorporating his chemical theories, his wound treatment methods, his understanding of disease as specific entities. This was one of only a few books published during his lifetime. Most of his work remained in manuscript form until after his death, but this one made it into print, and it was successful. Surgeons across Europe read it, debated it, adopted some of its techniques. Surgery was considered inferior to medicine in the medical hierarchy. Physicians diagnosed and prescribed. Surgeons, often trained as barbers rather than university scholars, did the manual work of cutting and stitching. Paracelsus rejected this division entirely. Surgery was medicine. The physician needed to understand anatomy, wound healing, the chemistry of infection. The surgeon needed to understand disease theory and proper medicine preparation. Artificial divisions between disciplines only harmed patients. His wound treatment methods were particularly revolutionary. Conventional practice involved keeping wounds covered with various ointments and salves, preventing air exposure, restricting drainage. Paracelsus insisted wounds needed to drain naturally. The body had healing powers if you didn't interfere. Clean the wound, remove debris, then let natural processes work. Don't pack it with complicated mixtures. Don't seal it completely. The body knows how to heal itself if you create proper conditions. This worked. Soldiers treated according to Paracelsus's methods healed faster with fewer infections. But the medical establishment dismissed it as folk medicine, unworthy of learned physicians. During 1537, while staying near Linz, Paracelsus completed his Astronomia Magna. This was his major philosophical work, attempting to synthesize his entire worldview into a coherent system. The universe, he argued, was a living organism pervaded by divine spirit. Humans were microcosms, containing the same principles as the macrocosm. Understanding the universe meant understanding humanity, and vice versa. Health arose from harmony between inner and outer worlds. This wasn't metaphor. Paracelsus believed in literal correspondences between cosmic forces and bodily functions. Planets influenced organs, minerals in the earth related to minerals in the body. The physician needed to understand these connections to treat disease effectively. Modern readers struggle with this worldview. It mixes what we'd call science, magic, religion, and philosophy into an inseparable whole. But for Paracelsus, these weren't separate domains. They were different aspects of understanding nature's unity. His alchemy operated on the same principle. Transmuting lead into gold wasn't just chemical transformation, it was spiritual purification, the perfection of matter through understanding its essential nature. The alchemist who mastered these processes could heal diseases by transforming corrupted matter back into pure form. He distinguished his approach from what he called supernatural magic. That was superstition, attempting to control forces through rituals and incantations. His alchemy worked through natural powers, understanding and cooperating with processes God had built into creation. The line between these seems arbitrary to us, but Paracelsus saw clear distinctions. Natural magic meant understanding how nature actually worked, even if that included what we'd call supernatural elements. Superstitious magic meant trying to bypass natural laws through force of will. Throughout these wandering years, students continued seeking him out. No university position, no institutional authority, yet young physicians travelled across Europe to study with him for a few months. They'd find him in whatever town he currently occupied, learn his methods, copy his manuscripts, then return home carrying his ideas. This created an underground network. Paracelsian medicine spread through personal transmission, teacher to student, student to their own practice. The medical establishment couldn't fully suppress it because it wasn't centralized. It was distributed across hundreds of individual practitioners who'd learned directly from the source. He also maintained correspondence with scholars across Europe. Letters travelled slowly in the 16th century, but they travelled. Paracelsus exchanged ideas with humanists, alchemists, and sympathetic physicians. These letters debated theory, described case studies, argued about interpretations. Some of this correspondence survived. Reading it reveals Paracelsus could be remarkably patient when engaging with genuine intellectual inquiry. The arrogance and aggression that marked his public pronouncements softened in private exchange. He took questions seriously, explained his reasoning carefully, acknowledged uncertainty. The public persona was partly performance. He'd learned that direct confrontation drew attention, forced people to engage with ideas they'd otherwise ignore. Playing the role of aggressive reformer served strategic purposes, even if it made enemies. But the ideas were genuine. He believed everything he wrote, even when expressing it provocatively. The certainty wasn't act. He'd spent decades developing these theories through observation, experimentation, and philosophical reflection. He knew they were right because he'd tested them. The problem was convincing anyone else. Medical knowledge in the 16th century was deeply conservative. Galen and Avicenna weren't just authorities, they were foundations. Questioning them meant questioning everything physicians knew. Paracelsus wasn't asking for minor revisions. He was demanding complete reconstruction from different principles. And he was doing so while insulting everyone who disagreed, burning their books, and treating their credentials as worthless. Even physicians who found his methods effective hesitated to embrace his theories. You could adopt his wound treatments without accepting his cosmic philosophy. You could use his mineral medicines while still believing in humoral theory. This frustrated him enormously. The methods worked because of the theory. You couldn't separate technique from understanding. Treating his medicine as cookbook recipes missed the entire point. By the late 1530s, Paracelsus was approaching 50. He'd been wandering for over a decade since Basel. He'd written dozens of treatises, treated thousands of patients, trained hundreds of students. His reputation as a physician was solid despite his notoriety as a troublemaker. But he had no home, no position, no security. Everything he owned fit in travelling chests. He depended on whatever patients could pay and whatever temporary positions he could secure. The toll was showing. His health was declining. Years of hard travel, poor living conditions, and likely his own experimental medicine use were catching up. He needed to settle somewhere, to finally establish himself permanently. In 1541, an opportunity emerged. The Prince Archbishop of Salzburg invited him to return to the city, where he'd first tried to practice medicine 16 years earlier. This time, he'd have official protection and support. Paracelsus accepted. After 15 years of wandering, he was going home to Salzburg. Finally, he'd have the stability to compile his life's work, to train students properly, to practice medicine without constantly looking over his shoulder. He arrived in Salzburg in the summer of 1541. 3 months later, he was dead. The circumstances surrounding his death remain murky. What happened in those 3 months? He arrived in good spirits. The Prince Archbishop Ernst had extended the invitation personally. Paracelsus would serve as court physician, a position of genuine prestige. More importantly, he'd have protection from the medical establishment that had hounded him for years. He settled into lodgings at the White Horse Inn on Kaigasse, a narrow street in Salzburg's old town. The inn still stands today. Contemporary accounts describe him treating patients, working on manuscripts, receiving visitors. Nothing suggested imminent danger. Then on September 24th, 1541, he died suddenly. He was 47 years old. The official cause was listed as natural. Some accounts mention a stroke or heart failure, but whispers started immediately. Had he been poisoned? Murdered by physicians who saw him as a threat? Thrown from a height by hired thugs? These theories persist because the death was convenient for too many people. Paracelsus had powerful enemies. The medical establishment had tried to destroy his reputation for years. Now he'd returned to prominence under princely protection. Eliminating him permanently solved that problem. His student Johannes Apollonius later claimed Paracelsus drank heavily, that alcohol contributed to his early death. This testimony is complicated. Apollonius had turned against his former teacher, publishing attacks on Paracelsus's character. His credibility is questionable. What we know for certain is minimal. Paracelsus died suddenly after 3 months in Salzburg. His possessions were seized by church authorities who claimed rights over property of semi-serfs, which his mother's status had made him. His manuscripts scattered. Some were confiscated, others disappeared. A few survived through students who'd made copies. He was buried in the cemetery of St. Sebastian's Church. The grave was later moved when the cemetery was renovated. His skull was exhumed and examined in the 20th century. Scientists found evidence of mercury poisoning, which makes sense given his extensive work with metallic compounds. Whether this contributed to his death or was just occupational exposure is impossible to determine. The monument erected over his grave includes an epitaph he supposedly wrote himself. It reads in Latin, roughly translated, "Here lies Philippus Theophrastus, distinguished doctor of medicine, who cured wounds, leprosy, gout, dropsy, and other incurable diseases of the body with wonderful skill, and who gave his goods to be divided and distributed to the poor." In the year 1541, on the 24th day of September, he exchanged life for death. Notice what it emphasizes, not his theories or philosophical contributions, his practical achievements as a healer, the cures he performed, the charity he showed. This is how he wanted to be remembered, as a physician who helped people, not as a revolutionary who challenged orthodoxy. But history remembers both. His death didn't end his influence. If anything, it accelerated it. Within years, his manuscripts began circulating more widely. Students published texts from notes they'd taken during his lectures. Editors compiled collections of his writings. The works he'd struggled to publish during his lifetime found audiences after his death. This created its own problems. Paracelsian texts proliferated in the late 16th century, but many were spurious. Publishers attributed works to Paracelsus that he'd never written, cashing in on his growing reputation. Separating authentic texts from forgeries became a scholarly challenge that continues today. The genuine works were revolutionary enough. His medical writings described treatments that actually worked. Physicians began adopting his methods even while dismissing his theories. You could use laudanum for pain without accepting his cosmic philosophy. You could apply his wound treatments without believing in the prima. This pragmatic adoption spread his influence further than theoretical conversion would have. Doctors who thought Paracelsus was a madman still used his techniques because they produced results. His chemistry entered medicine through the back door. The religious wars that consumed Europe after his death created unexpected opportunities for his ideas. Protestant regions were more receptive to challenges against Catholic medical authorities. Paracelsian medicine became associated with religious reform in some areas. This was ironic given Paracelsus's own ambiguous relationship with both Catholic and Protestant establishments. His emphasis on direct observation and experiment aligned with the emerging scientific method. Francis Bacon, writing decades later, advocated similar approaches. The Royal Society in England, founded in 1660, embraced empirical investigation over reliance on ancient authorities. Paracelsus had argued for exactly this a century earlier. But his legacy is complicated. He was simultaneously ahead of his time and deeply embedded in it. His chemistry was innovative, his cosmology was medieval, his clinical observations were acute, his theoretical explanations mixed insight with mysticism. Consider his three principles: sulfur, mercury, and salt. He claimed these existed in all substances, and that disease resulted from imbalances among them. This is wrong by modern standards. Elements don't work that way. But the underlying insight, that chemical composition affects biological function, was correct. He just lacked the framework to explain it accurately. His emphasis on specific diseases having specific treatments was revolutionary. The humoral theory treated all illness as imbalance requiring rebalancing. Paracelsus said, different diseases need different remedies targeted to their specific causes. This is fundamentally correct, even though his understanding of those causes was flawed. He introduced mercury, antimony, and other minerals as medicines. Some of these are toxic. Modern medicine doesn't use them the way he did, but the principle that chemical compounds can treat disease became foundational. Pharmacology as a discipline descends partly from Paracelsian chemistry. His wound care techniques emphasized cleanliness and natural drainage. He opposed the common practice of probing wounds with dirty instruments and applying caustic substances. This saved countless lives, even though he couldn't explain why in terms of infection and bacteria. His recognition of occupational diseases, especially in miners, established that environmental factors cause specific illnesses. This seems obvious now. In his time, most physicians attributed disease to internal imbalances or divine punishment. Paracelsus observed that certain jobs made people sick in particular ways, and that removing them from those environments could restore health. His writings on mental illness argued for humane treatment and rejected demonic possession as explanation. He wasn't entirely modern in his understanding. He believed in astral influences on the mind, but he treated mental patients as ill rather than possessed, which was progressive for his era. The complexity of his legacy reflects the transitional period he inhabited. Medieval and modern worldviews coexisted in his thinking. He rejected ancient authorities while maintaining belief in cosmic correspondences. He demanded empirical evidence while accepting alchemical transmutation. He was a bridge figure, 1 foot in each era. This makes evaluating him difficult. If you judge by modern standards, he was often wrong. If you compare him to his contemporaries, he was remarkably advanced. The fairest assessment considers both what he got right and what he got wrong, recognizing that progress happens through partial insights that later thinkers refine. His influence on pharmacy was enormous. The first London Pharmacopoeia, published in 1618, included many Paracelsian remedies. These gradually replaced traditional herbal medicines as the standard treatments. Chemical pharmacy emerged from his innovations, even as later chemists discarded his theoretical framework. His impact on medical education was subtler but significant. His insistence on teaching in vernacular languages rather than Latin, his inclusion of non-academic practitioners, his emphasis on observation over textual authority, all these challenged traditional medical pedagogy. Universities resisted these changes, but gradually adopted elements of his approach. His philosophical ideas influenced various esoteric traditions. The Rosicrucians claimed him as a spiritual ancestor. Alchemists treated his writings as foundational texts. This association with occultism later damaged his reputation among scientists seeking to establish medicine as a rational discipline. By the 18th century, Paracelsus was viewed ambivalently. His practical contributions were recognized. His theoretical framework was dismissed as superstition. The Enlightenment valued empiricism but rejected mysticism. Paracelsus embodied both, making him difficult to categorize. The 19th century saw renewed interest in his life. Romantic writers appreciated his rebellious individualism. The image of Paracelsus as a misunderstood genius ahead of his time became popular. This romanticization obscured both his real achievements and his real limitations. Modern medical history has tried to assess him more carefully. Scholars examine his texts in context, comparing his ideas to contemporary medical practice. This reveals a more complex figure than either his supporters or critics suggested. He was innovative in specific areas while remaining traditional in others. His contributions were real, but not as revolutionary as his rhetoric suggested. His personality remains controversial. Was he a visionary, unfairly persecuted, or an arrogant troublemaker who alienated potential supporters? The evidence supports both interpretations. He was brilliant and abrasive, insightful and dogmatic, ahead of his time and bound by it. What's undeniable is that he changed medicine. Not single-handedly, not immediately, but his work catalyzed shifts that transformed how physicians understood disease and treatment. The chemical medicine he pioneered became standard practice. His emphasis on observation and specificity influenced later reformers. He died alone in a Salzburg inn, his life's work scattered and incomplete. But the ideas survived. They spread through networks he'd established, through students he'd trained, through manuscripts he'd written. 3 months in Salzburg wasn't enough time to accomplish what he'd hoped. 47 years wasn't enough either. Yet he'd done more than most people manage in twice that span. He'd challenged the foundations of medicine, introduced new treatments, trained a generation of reformers, and planted ideas that would grow for centuries after his death. The White Horse Inn where he died still operates. Tourists visit, though few recognise the significance of the location. The house in Einsiedeln, where he was born, is now a museum. His grave in Salzburg draws visitors interested in medical history. These physical traces connect us to a life lived 5 centuries ago. But the real legacy isn't in buildings or bones. It's in the concepts he introduced that became so fundamental we forget they had to be discovered. That chemicals can cure disease, that different illnesses need different treatments, that observation matters more than authority, that dose makes the poison. These simple concepts revolutionized how we think about health. Before Paracelsus, medicine was theoretical. After him, it became experimental. The shift took generations, but it was irreversible. His writings spread through networks of students and sympathizers. Some were published during his lifetime, mostly without his permission or proper editing. Others circulated as manuscripts, copied and recopied, accumulating errors and interpolations. Many weren't published until decades after his death. This created problems. Spurious works were attributed to him. His genuine texts were altered by editors who didn't understand his system. By the late 16th century, determining what Paracelsus actually wrote became a scholarly challenge that remains partially unresolved. The first major collected edition appeared in the 1580s, 40 years after his death. It contained genuine works mixed with forgeries. Later editions tried to be more selective, but the damage was done. Paracelsus's reputation became entangled with texts he never wrote and ideas he never held. Yet even corrupted, his influence grew. Physicians across Europe adopted his chemical medicines. Universities began teaching iatrochemistry, the medical application of chemistry. The transformation happened gradually, without fanfare, as practical results proved more persuasive than theoretical arguments. England embraced Paracelsian medicine enthusiastically. The Royal Society, founded in 1660, included several members who championed his approach. Robert Boyle, often called the father of modern chemistry, acknowledged Paracelsus as an important predecessor. Isaac Newton studied his alchemical writings carefully. France was more resistant. The Paris medical faculty clung to Galenic orthodoxy longer than most. But even there, individual physicians quietly adopted Paracelsian remedies while publicly maintaining traditional facades. Results mattered more than ideology. Germany produced the most devoted followers. The iatrochemical school flourished there, developing his ideas in directions he might not have recognized. They systematized what he'd left chaotic, clarified what he'd left obscure, and discarded what seemed too mystical for practical application. This process of selective adoption characterized Paracelsian influence generally. Later generations took what worked and ignored what didn't. His chemical remedies were adopted widely. His cosmological theories were mostly forgotten. His personality cult faded while his practical contributions endured. The irony is that Paracelsus would have hated this. He insisted his system was unified, that you couldn't separate the practical from the theoretical. To adopt his medicines while rejecting his philosophy was to misunderstand him fundamentally. But that's exactly what happened, and it's why his influence lasted. Medical education changed because of him, though not immediately. Universities still taught primarily from books in the 17th century, but increasingly they supplemented texts with demonstrations, experiments, and clinical observation. The shift from authority to evidence accelerated. His emphasis on specificity transformed diagnostic practice. Physicians began distinguishing between diseases that earlier generations had lumped together. This led to better classification systems and eventually to more targeted treatments. The process took centuries to complete, but Paracelsus initiated it. Toxicology developed as a distinct discipline, largely from his foundation. His principle that dose determines poison became central to understanding drug action. Modern pharmaceutical development still relies on this concept, adjusting dosages to maximize benefit while minimizing harm. Occupational medicine traces its origins to his work on miners' diseases. He was the first to systematically study how workplace conditions affected health. Later investigators built on his observations, expanding the field to include other industries and hazards. Psychiatry acknowledges him as a pioneer, though his specific treatments wouldn't be recognizable to modern practitioners. What mattered was his insistence that mental illness was illness, not demon possession. This opened the door to medical treatment of psychological conditions. Surgery benefited from his innovations in wound care. His rejection of harmful interventions and his emphasis on natural healing influenced surgical practice for generations. Modern wound management still follows principles he articulated, though expressed in very different language. The pharmaceutical industry owes him an enormous debt. He demonstrated that chemicals could be medicines, that synthetic compounds could heal as effectively as herbs. This concept enabled the development of modern drug manufacturing. Every pill you've ever taken exists because Paracelsus proved the concept was viable. His legacy includes darker elements. Some of his followers became charlatans, selling worthless concoctions while invoking his name. The association between Paracelsianism and fraud damaged legitimate practitioners and delayed acceptance of his genuine contributions. The mystical aspects of his thought attracted occultists and esotericists. By the 18th century, Paracelsus was claimed by Rosicrucians, Freemasons, and various Hermetic societies. These groups emphasized his alchemical and magical writings while ignoring his practical medical work. This split his reputation. Scientists dismissed him as a mystic. Mystics ignored his science. Only in recent decades have historians tried to understand him as a whole person, recognizing that for him, chemistry and cosmology, medicine and magic were inseparable parts of a unified worldview. Carl Jung studied him intensively, finding in Paracelsus's writings anticipations of depth psychology. Jung appreciated the psychological dimension of Paracelsian alchemy, interpreting the transformation of substances as symbols for psychological transformation. Whether Paracelsus would have recognized this interpretation is debatable. Modern alternative medicine sometimes claims him as a founder, pointing to his holistic approach and his emphasis on natural healing. This appropriation is problematic. Paracelsus was an innovator who used cutting-edge chemistry. He wasn't advocating a return to nature, but a leap forward into chemical therapeutics. His actual methods were often harsh. Mercury compounds are toxic. Some of his treatments probably killed patients, but in context, they were improvements over existing options. Gradual refinement made them safer and more effective. The principle was sound, even when specific applications were dangerous. Academic medicine eventually absorbed his innovations while rejecting his rhetoric. Universities taught chemistry as foundational to medicine. They emphasized observation over textual authority. They recognized disease specificity and treatment individualization. All Paracelsian principles implemented without acknowledging the source. This erasure was partly deliberate. By the 19th century, medicine wanted to distance itself from its unscientific past. Paracelsus, with his alchemical language and mystical cosmology, seemed embarrassing. Better to credit later, more respectable figures who had actually built on his foundation. The rehabilitation began in the 20th century. As historians examined primary sources more carefully, they discovered a more complex figure than the caricature suggested. Not a pure scientist or a pure mystic, but someone operating in a transitional period when those categories didn't yet exist. His personality remains controversial. Modern biographers debate whether he was a visionary or a crank, a genius or a fraud. The evidence supports multiple interpretations. He was brilliant in some areas and obstinate in others. He made genuine discoveries and propagated nonsense. He helped patients and alienated allies. What's clear is that he changed medicine permanently. The shift from Galenic theory to chemical practice, from humoral balance to specific pathology, from herbal remedies to mineral drugs, all bear his influence. Not solely his influence, he worked within a broader movement of medical reform. But he was a catalyst, accelerating changes that might have taken longer without his intervention. His writings are difficult to read. The Latin is idiosyncratic, mixing classical forms with Germanic constructions. The German versions are equally challenging, using alchemical terminology and neologisms that obscure meaning. Translators struggle to render his thought into modern language without distorting it. This has limited his direct readership to specialists. Most people know Paracelsus through secondary sources, through interpretations and summaries, rather than his own words. This creates distance, filtering his ideas through other minds. We get Paracelsus refracted, not Paracelsus himself. Yet even refracted, he remains compelling. The boldness of his challenge to authority, the sweep of his ambition, the genuine discoveries mixed with wild speculation, all create a figure larger than life. He was trying to remake medicine from the ground up, to establish it on new foundations. He didn't entirely succeed, but he shifted the direction of the entire field. His death in 1541 ended his personal story, but not his influence. Students carried his teachings across Europe. Manuscripts circulated, were copied, were debated. Some physicians adopted his methods enthusiastically. Others rejected them completely. Most took elements they found useful while ignoring the rest. The selective adoption created a sanitized Paracelsus, stripped of his most controversial claims. The chemical medicine survived, the cosmology faded, the personality cult diminished. What remained was a set of practical innovations that transformed medical practice over the following centuries. Modern medicine doesn't look Paracelsian superficially. We don't talk about sulfur, mercury, and salt as principles. We don't invoke cosmic correspondences. We don't treat the body as a microcosm of the universe. But underneath, his fingerprints are everywhere. When a doctor prescribes a specific drug for a specific condition at a specific dose, that's Paracelsian thinking. When researchers study how workplace toxins cause disease, they're following his lead. When psychiatrists treat mental illness as medical rather than spiritual problems, they're building on his foundation. The concepts he introduced are so fundamental, we forget they needed to be discovered. That's the mark of truly transformative ideas. They become invisible, absorbed into the fabric of thought so completely that we can't imagine thinking any other way. Paracelsus would probably hate what modern medicine has become. Too specialized, too divorced from philosophy, too focused on mechanisms without understanding meaning. He wanted a unified vision of health that encompassed body, mind, and cosmos. We've fragmented that vision into separate disciplines that barely communicate, but he'd recognize the empirical approach, the emphasis on observation over authority, the willingness to try new treatments, the focus on what actually works rather than what tradition dictates. These were his principles, and they survived even as his cosmology collapsed. The tension between his achievements and his limitations reflects a broader truth about scientific progress. Advances rarely come from pure rationality. They emerge from people who are brilliant and flawed, insightful and dogmatic, right about some things, and spectacularly wrong about others. Paracelsus embodied these contradictions more dramatically than most. He was a genius who couldn't get along with anyone, a reformer who alienated potential allies, a healer who probably killed some patients, a visionary who clung to outdated metaphysics. All of these simultaneously, without resolution. That's what makes him fascinating 5 centuries later. Not because he was perfect, but because he was human, driven by ambition and insecurity, brilliance and stubbornness, genuine care for patients, and impossible arrogance. A walking contradiction who nevertheless changed medicine forever. The question of what happens to revolutionary ideas after their revolutionary dies is rarely straightforward. Ideas don't transmit cleanly. They mutate, fragment, get misunderstood, and repurposed. What reaches the next generation often bears only passing resemblance to the original vision. With Paracelsus, this process began immediately. His followers weren't unified. Some embraced the chemical medicine while rejecting the cosmic philosophy. Others kept the mysticism but abandoned the practical innovations. A few tried to preserve everything, becoming more Paracelsian than Paracelsus himself. The immediate aftermath of his death in 1541 saw his reputation split into competing factions. Medical conservatives dismissed him as a dangerous charlatan whose methods had killed patients. Radical reformers elevated him to near-prophetic status, claiming he'd revealed secrets the establishment wanted suppressed. Neither version was accurate, but both were influential. His writings presented a problem. He'd published almost nothing during his lifetime. What existed were manuscripts, lecture notes, treatises that circulated among students and colleagues. After his death, these began appearing in print, often without clear attribution or editorial oversight. Some publications were genuine Paracelsus, others were spurious, written by followers or enemies and attributed to him for credibility or mockery. Still others were compilations, mixing authentic material with additions and interpretations. The result was a textual mess that made it nearly impossible to determine what he'd actually written. This wasn't unusual for the period. Copyright didn't exist. Attribution was fluid. If something sounded like it could have come from Paracelsus, it might get attached to his name regardless of actual authorship. His reputation became a brand, and brands attract imitators. The first major collection appeared in 1589, nearly 50 years after his death. It ran to multiple volumes and claimed to represent his complete works. It didn't. It included authentic texts alongside forgeries and heavily edited versions that smoothed out contradictions and made the philosophy seem more systematic than it actually was. But this collection, flawed as it was, became how most people encountered Paracelsus. It shaped his reputation for generations. The real man disappeared behind the curated version, the sanitized Paracelsus, who fit more comfortably into emerging scientific frameworks. His followers divided into schools. The chemical physicians focused on practical therapeutics, developing his mineral and metallic remedies while quietly abandoning the cosmic correspondences. They were pragmatists who wanted what worked and didn't care about philosophical consistency. The Rosicrucians and other mystical movements claimed him as a spiritual teacher, emphasizing the alchemical and magical elements while downplaying the clinical innovations. They saw him as an initiate into ancient wisdom, a bridge between Hermetic tradition and modern knowledge. Both groups were right and wrong. Paracelsus had been both clinical innovator and mystical philosopher, but neither side wanted the complete package. It was easier to extract the parts that served their purposes and ignore the rest. The medical establishment remained hostile for decades. Universities continued teaching Galenic medicine well into the 17th century. Paracelsian physicians were often excluded from official medical societies and faced prosecution for practicing without proper credentials. But the remedies kept working. Mercury compounds proved effective against syphilis. Opium preparations relieved pain. Iron supplements treated certain anemias. The results were undeniable, even when the theoretical justifications seemed absurd. Gradually, pragmatism won. Physicians who publicly rejected Paracelsus privately adopted his treatments. They claimed to be following classical methods while quietly incorporating chemical medicines. The hypocrisy was transparent, but necessary for maintaining professional standing. By the 17th century, a compromise had emerged. The concept of iatrochemistry, medical chemistry, allowed physicians to use chemical remedies without accepting Paracelsian philosophy. They could prescribe mercury for syphilis while denying the existence of the archeus or the three principles. This selective adoption stripped away the mystical elements while preserving practical innovations. It was a victory for Paracelsian medicine, but a defeat for Paracelsian worldview. The unified vision of health, cosmos, and divinity fractured into separate domains that would never fully reconnect. The process reveals how scientific progress actually happens, not through sudden paradigm shifts where old theories are completely replaced, but through gradual infiltration where useful ideas from rejected systems slowly permeate the mainstream until they're no longer recognizable as foreign. His influence on toxicology proved particularly lasting. The principle that dose makes the poison became fundamental. Researchers studying workplace hazards, environmental contamination, and pharmaceutical safety all built on foundations he'd established. They rarely credited him, but the lineage was clear. The same pattern appeared in psychiatry. His insistence that mental illness had natural rather than supernatural causes took centuries to gain acceptance, but when it did, the transformation was complete. Modern psychiatry is unthinkable without that conceptual shift, even though most psychiatrists have never heard of Paracelsus. His surgical innovations followed a similar trajectory. The emphasis on clean wounds, proper drainage, and minimal intervention became standard practice. Surgeons in the 18th and 19th centuries were applying Paracelsian principles without knowing their origin. The irony is rich. A man who craved recognition, who named himself greater than Celsus, ended up influencing medicine so thoroughly that his contributions became invisible. His ideas survived by losing their association with him. This anonymity might have frustrated him, but it ensured his legacy. If Paracelsian medicine had remained explicitly Paracelsian, it would have been easier to reject as a package. By fragmenting and infiltrating gradually, his innovations became part of the medical mainstream before anyone realized what had happened. The mystical elements took longer to fade. Well into the 18th century, physicians were still debating whether diseases had astral influences, or whether the microcosm-macrocosm correspondence had medical relevance. The Enlightenment gradually pushed these ideas to the margins, but they never completely disappeared. Modern alternative medicine often claims Paracelsus as a spiritual ancestor. Homeopathy, despite contradicting his emphasis on proper dosing, sometimes invokes his name. Holistic health movements cite his integrated view of body, mind, and cosmos. These appropriations are historically dubious but culturally revealing. They show that his reputation remains contested. 5 centuries after his death, people still argue about what he represented and whether his legacy was positive or negative. That ongoing debate is itself evidence of significance. Forgotten figures don't generate controversy. The academic rehabilitation began in the 20th century. Historians started examining him in context rather than judging him by modern standards. They recognized that his mysticism wasn't ignorance, but a different framework for understanding nature, one that made sense within Renaissance cosmology. This scholarship revealed complexity that earlier assessments had missed. He wasn't simply right or wrong, progressive or retrograde. He was a transitional figure standing between medieval and modern worldviews, trying to synthesize elements that would later seem incompatible. The synthesis failed, but the attempt was valuable. It generated productive tensions that drove medicine forward even as the underlying philosophy collapsed. His insistence that theory must match observation, that authority must yield to evidence, survived the specific theories he proposed. Carl Jung's interest in him brought renewed attention in the mid-20th century. Jung saw Paracelsus as a psychological pioneer, someone who understood that healing required addressing the whole person rather than just physical symptoms. This reading emphasized aspects of his work that medical historians had dismissed as mystical nonsense. Jung's interpretation was selective and probably exaggerated Paracelsus's psychological insights, but it demonstrated that his writings could still generate new meanings, that they weren't simply historical curiosities, but living texts capable of speaking to contemporary concerns. That generative quality separates major figures from minor ones. Minor figures can be understood completely, boxed up and filed away. Major figures resist complete understanding. They keep revealing new dimensions as contexts change and new questions arise. Paracelsus remains generative because his work was genuinely original. He wasn't just applying existing frameworks or making incremental improvements. He was attempting to rebuild medicine from first principles, and that ambition created surplus meaning that couldn't be fully assimilated in his own time. Some of that surplus has been assimilated gradually across 5 centuries. Some remains contested or ignored. Some may yet prove valuable as medical paradigms continue evolving. The fact that we can't yet know what future generations will find useful in his work is itself significant. His personality continues fascinating people. The arrogance, the wandering, the conflicts, the drinking, these aren't incidental to his achievements, but somehow essential. A more cautious diplomatic figure would have accomplished less because caution and diplomacy meant accepting existing frameworks. Breaking frameworks requires a certain recklessness, a willingness to burn bridges and alienate potential allies. Paracelsus had that willingness in abundance. It made him impossible to work with, but also impossible to ignore. The same traits that destroyed his career ensured his ideas survived. This creates an uncomfortable question about genius and personality. Do revolutionary insights require difficult personalities? Or do difficult personalities simply make it harder to recognize when someone is actually onto something? Probably both. The correlation between genius and difficult temperament is real enough to notice, but not strong enough to be predictive. Some brilliant people are pleasant. Some difficult people are mediocrities. But there's a subset where the brilliance and the impossibility seem intertwined, where you can't imagine the achievements without the personality that made them possible. Paracelsus belonged to that subset. His contempt for authority drove both his innovations and his failures. His insistence on personal experience led to genuine discoveries and dangerous mistakes. His cosmic vision produced both insights and absurdities. The whole package came together, impossible to separate into neat categories of useful and useless, right and wrong. That irreducibility is part of what makes him endlessly fascinating. 5 centuries of scholarship haven't exhausted him. New biographies keep appearing, new interpretations, new arguments about what he really meant and whether we've properly appreciated his contributions. The debate continues because the subject resists final judgment. He remains difficult to categorize, which is exactly why he matters. The attempt to force him into conventional categories, scientific pioneer, mystical charlatan, revolutionary genius, dangerous fraud, always fails because he was simultaneously all and none of these things. His work exists at the intersection of multiple traditions, drawing from alchemy, medicine, theology, mining, and folk healing in ways that can't be cleanly separated into modern disciplinary boxes. This interdisciplinarity wasn't confusion or lack of rigor. It reflected a worldview where knowledge domains weren't yet compartmentalized, where studying metals and studying the human body and studying spiritual transformation were parts of a unified project. We've gained clarity by dividing knowledge into specialized fields, but we've lost something too, the ability to see connections across domains, to think in terms of whole systems rather than isolated components. Paracelsus operated in that older, more integrated mode. His medical theories drew on cosmic principles. His alchemical work had spiritual dimensions. His theology incorporated natural philosophy. Modern readers find this maddening because we keep wanting to extract the useful medical insights from the metaphysical framework to separate the chemistry from the mysticism. But they weren't separable in his mind. The framework generated the insights. Consider his most famous principle: the dose makes the poison. This seems like straightforward toxicology, easily detachable from his cosmic theories. But Paracelsus arrived at it through his broader understanding of correspondence between macrocosm and microcosm. His belief that substances contained both healing and harmful properties depending on preparation and application. The insight emerged from the worldview, not despite it. This raises uncomfortable questions about innovation. Do breakthrough insights require comprehensive frameworks, even when those frameworks contain errors? Can you reach revolutionary conclusions through flawed reasoning? The answer appears to be yes, which suggests that rigid adherence to correct methodology might sometimes inhibit rather than enable discovery. Paracelsus wasn't rigorous by modern standards. He made logical leaps, trusted analogies too readily, asserted cosmic principles without proof. Yet these methodological failures led him to genuine discoveries that more careful thinkers missed. The willingness to be wrong in interesting ways sometimes produces better results than the determination to never be wrong at all. His death in 1541 came suddenly. He was staying in Salzburg under the patronage of Archbishop Ernst of Bavaria. On September 24th, at age 47, he died under circumstances that remain disputed. Some accounts suggest he fell from a height, possibly during a tavern brawl, suffering head injuries. Others claim he was poisoned by enemies or died from internal ailments. His final resting place is St. Sebastian's Cemetery in Salzburg, where his gravestone identifies him simply as Doctor of Medicine. The ambiguity surrounding his death feels appropriate somehow. A man who lived in constant conflict, who made enemies everywhere he went, who challenged every authority he encountered. His end should be mysterious and contested. The uncertainty mirrors the larger uncertainty about how to evaluate his life's work. Most of his writings remained unpublished at his death. He'd written constantly during his wandering years, producing theological treatises, medical texts, alchemical works, philosophical reflections. But finding publishers proved difficult. His reputation as a troublemaker preceded him. His ideas seemed too radical, his language too crude, his attacks on authorities too inflammatory. After his death, disciples and students began collecting and publishing his works. The process took decades. Texts circulated in manuscript, were copied with errors and additions, appeared in unauthorized editions. By the late 16th century, a substantial corpus existed, though establishing which texts were authentically his remained problematic. Spurious works appeared under his name, capitalizing on his growing reputation. This posthumous publishing history created its own distortions. Editors selected what to publish based on their own agendas. Alchemists emphasized his mystical writings. Medical reformers highlighted his practical innovations. Theological radicals extracted his religious critiques. Each group claimed Paracelsus as their precursor, while ignoring aspects that didn't fit their narratives. The result was multiple Paracelsuses, each constructed by different communities for different purposes. The medical Paracelsus, who pioneered chemical therapy. The alchemical Paracelsus, who sought spiritual transformation through material processes. The theological Paracelsus, who challenged church authority. The social revolutionary, who sided with peasants against nobles. All based on genuine aspects of his work, none capturing the whole. This fragmentation continues. Medical historians focus on his contributions to pharmacology while dismissing his cosmic theories. Historians of alchemy examine his spiritual philosophy while downplaying his practical medicine. Scholars of early modern religion analyze his theological writings in isolation from his scientific work. Each specialty claims its piece, and the integrated whole disappears. Yet recovering that integrated whole proves nearly impossible because we lack the conceptual framework he inhabited. We can't think his thoughts in his terms because those terms have become unintelligible. When he writes about the astral body, or mumia, or the archeus, we either translate these into modern concepts, which distorts their meaning, or leave them untranslated, which renders them opaque. The problem isn't just linguistic, but ontological. Paracelsus believed in things, in substantive, real things, that we've decided don't exist. Not that they're false descriptions of real phenomena, but that they're not even wrong, just category mistakes. This makes genuine historical understanding extraordinarily difficult. We can describe what he believed, but we can't fully inhabit his worldview, because we can't make ourselves believe what he believed. This epistemological gap separates us from all pre-modern thinkers, but it's especially acute with Paracelsus because his work sits right at the transition between medieval and modern ways of thinking. He's close enough that we recognize elements of scientific method, observation, experimentation, skepticism toward authority, but far enough that his basic assumptions about reality differ fundamentally from ours. His influence on later medicine took unexpected paths. The iatrochemical school that developed in the late 16th and early 17th centuries claimed him as founder. Physicians like Jan Baptist van Helmont and Franciscus Sylvius built chemical medicine traditions that owed debts to Paracelsus's pioneering work, though they often modified or rejected his specific theories. Van Helmont in particular represents an interesting case. He adopted Paracelsus's chemical approach to medicine, but criticized his cosmic theories as mystical nonsense. This selective appropriation, taking the method while rejecting the metaphysics, became a common pattern. Later generations extracted what seemed useful while dismissing what seemed superstitious. Yet this extraction process involved distortion. Paracelsus's chemical medicine was inseparable from his broader worldview. His therapeutic principles derived from his understanding of cosmic correspondence. By removing the metaphysical framework, Van Helmont and others created something new, something Paracelsus might not have recognized as his own project. This raises questions about intellectual inheritance. When later thinkers adopt ideas from earlier ones while rejecting the context that generated those ideas, are they truly inheritors, or are they creating something fundamentally different? The continuity is real. Van Helmont wouldn't have developed his system without Paracelsus's precedent, but so is the rupture. The meanings have changed, even when the terminology remains similar. The alchemical tradition claimed him as well, though here too the relationship was complex. Paracelsus distinguished sharply between true alchemy, aimed at healing, and false alchemy, aimed at gold-making. He dismissed transmutation as either fraud or misguided effort. Yet alchemists after him often ignored these distinctions, reading his works as supporting their metallurgical projects. The Rosicrucian movement of the early 17th century adopted him as a spiritual ancestor, emphasizing the mystical and transformative aspects of his alchemy. They created a mythologized Paracelsus, a sage who'd achieved secret wisdom, who traveled to mysterious lands and learned from hidden masters. This legendary figure bore limited resemblance to the historical person, but proved influential in shaping esoteric traditions. By the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers had mostly rejected him. The scientific revolution had established new standards of evidence and explanation. Paracelsus's appeals to cosmic sympathy and occult virtues seemed like primitive superstition. His chemical medicine had been superseded by more sophisticated approaches. His reputation declined sharply among medical professionals. Romantic thinkers rehabilitated him somewhat, valuing his emphasis on nature, his rejection of sterile book learning, his insistence on personal experience. Goethe expressed admiration for aspects of his thought, particularly his understanding of nature as alive and interconnected. But this romantic Paracelsus was another construction, highlighting elements that fit 19th century concerns while ignoring others. The 20th century brought renewed scholarly interest, this time more historically rigorous. Historians of science examined him as a transitional figure between medieval and modern medicine. They acknowledged both his innovations and his limitations, placing him in proper historical context rather than simply celebrating or condemning him. Carl Jung's engagement with Paracelsus proved particularly influential. Jung saw him as a psychological pioneer, someone who understood that healing required addressing the whole person, body, mind, and spirit, rather than just treating physical symptoms. Jung's interpretation emphasized the psychological dimensions of Paracelsus's alchemy, reading his chemical transformations as symbols for internal spiritual development. This psychological reading opened new dimensions in Paracelsus's work, but also imposed Jung's own framework on texts that weren't originally written with that framework in mind. Jung found depth psychology in Paracelsus because he was looking for it, projecting 20th century concepts onto 16th century texts. The result was illuminating, but also anachronistic. Recent scholarship has become more cautious about imposing modern categories on early modern thinkers. Instead of asking whether Paracelsus was a scientist or a mystic, historians examine how he integrated elements we now separate. Instead of extracting the rational kernel from the mystical husk, they study the worldview as a whole, understanding how its parts function together. This approach reveals Paracelsus as neither ahead of his time nor behind it, but thoroughly of his time, working within and pushing against the intellectual constraints of early 16th century Europe. His innovations emerged from engagement with his own context, not from somehow transcending it. What remains valuable isn't just specific discoveries, though some of those endure, but his demonstration that challenging authority can be productive, that observation matters more than tradition, that practical experience generates knowledge books can't provide. These methodological principles survived even as his specific theories were abandoned. His career also demonstrates the costs of being right too early. Many of his insights were rejected not because they were wrong, but because they contradicted established frameworks. The rejection was rational given what people knew and believed at the time. Only later, when contexts changed, did his ideas become acceptable. This suggests that innovation often requires not just having good ideas, but having them at moments when they can be heard. Timing matters. The same idea proposed in different contexts receives different receptions. Paracelsus had many good ideas at bad times, when institutional structures and intellectual frameworks weren't ready to accommodate them. He paid the price for that mistiming with his career, his reputation, his inability to establish stable institutions that might have preserved and developed his work. But the ideas survived anyway, transmitted through disciples, extracted by later thinkers, gradually incorporated into medical practice, even as their originator was forgotten or dismissed. That pattern of influence without credit is common in intellectual history. The people who make breakthroughs often don't receive recognition. The people who receive recognition often weren't the first to have the ideas. Paracelsus experienced both sides, credited with innovations he didn't quite make, forgotten for contributions he did make. The question of how to remember him remains contested. Medical schools mention him briefly as a historical figure who pioneered chemical therapy. Historians of science debate his significance and originality. Esoteric traditions claim him as a spiritual master. Popular culture occasionally references his name, usually getting the details wrong. None of these memories capture the complete person, the difficult, brilliant, impossible man who spent his life fighting authorities and proposing alternatives, who drank too much and wrote too much and offended too many people, who genuinely tried to heal the sick while also seeking cosmic truths, who failed in his own terms but succeeded in ways he never imagined.